they would, because now they have that benefit, that actual tangible benefit of the money that they're saving by switching to better environmental practices. Let's go ahead and talk about the developed countries. And again, we already showed you how like 22% of those manufacturing deaths that are caused there. But that means that we end up having a better quality of life in the long run. We have places like China, where a lot of the air pollution and the toxic chemicals in the air are so bad, a lot of people have to wear either protective clothing or even carry around umbrellas just to protect themselves from inhaling or having direct skin contact with the dangerous chemicals that are in the air. And that's just a glimpse into what the world looks like when you have all these bad environmental practices. Because we're not helping create a more sustainable tomorrow that not only hurts the environment, that hurts all of the people who are in the environment and have to live with that on a day-to-day basis. We're also creating a more sustainable tomorrow for the lives of our children and our children's children. We're using safer products in the long run. We can see another example through this in the form of e-waste. Now, e-waste is electronic waste. Developed countries often ship their electronic waste to developing countries. We make a lot of these electronic devices out of things that are not sustainable consumer products. And as a result, that ends up creating a lot of problems for the people that e-waste ends up with. Again, in another example of China, where a lot of people end up dying from radiation poisoning because they're coming into direct contact with this e-waste and with these products. There's actually a study conducted in a small town in China that showed, in an area where they imported a lot of e-waste, it showed that 69% of children in that town had lead poisoning. So hurting the environment doesn't just impact the environment, it impacts people's lives inside that environment. We end up with long-term benefits in the long run. Yes?
So do you change the way that electronic waste is disposed, or do we just get more sustainable electronic waste from here out, supposedly?
We're helping to fix that issue by making products that are sustainable products,
Great.
Meaning that we're making things out of things that are safer and they're not toxic to people, meaning that we don't have that harm of coming into direct contact with electronic waste. So it supports human health and it supports environmental protection. Let's go ahead and take a look at how it also goes even a step further in our second substandard. But it helps give the government more revenue. And we're going to see this in two main ways. First, we're going to see that even though the government is losing this money in the form of tax revenue, they actually are saving a lot of money in the long run. And why is that? The government currently invests millions of dollars in making environmental policies to try to make things more sustainable. In the United States, the EPA comes out with roughly 900 new regulations annually, and the costs of those are very substantial. So when we're using the companies themselves and incentivizing them to have good environmental practices, that means that the government doesn't have to spend nearly as much on the manufacturing sector to try to fix those issues. We have the companies fix them themselves, which means the government it ends up balancing out the cost. The government isn't spending all of that money on environmental resources, so even though they're losing that tax revenue, they end up gaining a lot more revenue in the long run. And this creates the impact of a more efficient system. Because the government doesn't have to worry about the manufacturing sector as much, that means that we end up with a lot more things that they can do with those resources that they wouldn't otherwise be capable of doing at the same time with their limited funds. But now let's go ahead and take a look at the companies, because the companies benefit from this obviously as well because of the tax breaks. And the only way that companies make a lot of money and build popularity is by building consumer trust. They build consumer trust by spending a lot of their funds on movements and things that people care about. You can see an example of this through Apple, who supported things like the LGBTQA+ rights. So by doing these sorts of things, by helping the minorities, companies who gain more revenue now have more revenue to spend on these important things. So we're making time and opportunities to help out with a lot of these important movements that honestly otherwise wouldn't be capable of doing. So when we're taking a look at the long run, we see that abolishing this tax on sustainable consumer products is not only beneficial for people's lives and livelihoods, but it also helps the government to create better policies as well. So in the end, we see the long-term success and the long-term benefits of abolishing this tax. Thank you.
looking at some big economic flaws that Team Proposition has come up with and referencing exactly how the abolition of this VAT tax would actually work. We're going to be looking at their points about how it's incentivizing good behavior and actually addressing them with some of our own. First off, talking about the fact that taking away this tax is actually going to reduce our ability to promote unsustainable practices. And then later on, Madison will also be talking about the fact that we're going to have environmental damage that's actually worsened. Now, this is in direct contrast to the opinions of Team Proposition, and we're going to be looking at the specifics as to why both of those things are true. First off, let's look at some of the things from their last speech. And their first point was talking about how we're going to incentivize good behavior by removing a tax on sustainable products. It was their contention that if we don't have a tax on sustainable products, people will therefore switch their goods and switch their practices over to sustainability so that they no longer have to pay a tax. But here's where the fatal mindset is. It's their idea that it's cheaper to essentially not pay the tax than it is to simply engage in unsustainable practices. However, when you look around the world, most of the time, unsustainable practices are still cheaper. For example, child labor. When we look to China, as a lot of their examples were about, child labor in particular is way cheaper than even just not paying the VAT that we're referring to. And when we look to a company like Foxconn, who's directly associated with Apple, Microsoft, Samsung, etc., that's the way that they were able to reduce their costs, was to start hiring a lot of child labor. That's one of the things that we would simply continue seeing happen because it happens in the current system, and Team Proposition hasn't proven that this tax is so significant that it's actually going to incentivize companies to switch over. As it is, bad practices are in general still cheaper, and therefore people will remain in those bad practices. So everything we've had talking about the reduced air pollution deaths and reduced e-waste, etc., doesn't necessarily apply until they can prove that there is actually an incentive for companies to switch over. Because right now, logically speaking, and based on what we've seen in the modern world, bad practices are in general cheaper. I would also like to note that the majority of their arguments were referring to bad practices specifically occurring in the country of China, who doesn't have a VAT on their products right now. So while there is a lot of air pollution and e-waste, etc., happening in China, nothing would really change in China because we're not removing any sort of tax, as the tax does not exist. Finally, they talked about the e-waste, that we're reducing e-waste. And my response is simply looking at the fact that waste is still occurring. Their plan is not stopping waste from occurring. We're simply going to be wasting products and contributing to that e-waste in a manner that the production of those products are more sustainable. And we're not saying that we're going to stop waste. It's simply saying the production of products that will be wasted in the future is a little bit more sustainable. But once again, the waste continues, and so all the harms they talked about in reference to e-waste are not at all going away. Now, they also talked about the EPA and Apple. First of all, the EPA having 900 regulations on an annual basis referring to the environment, and Apple specifically contributing to LGBT rights. And I'm going to be talking about those and referencing those with my point, specifically how we are reducing the ability to promote unsustainable practices. I would like to note just real quickly, however, that they talked about Apple as a sustainable company with sustainable resources when Apple is one of the least sustainable companies that is currently in existence. They have incredibly bad policies as far as sustainability occurs because of the materials that they're working with. So we shouldn't assume that that's a good company that we should be contributing to for their sustainability. But let's look at that reduced ability to promote unsustainable practices. See, currently, the state, the government, is relying on revenue from sustainable products. There's currently, in the countries that we're talking about, a VAT on products, both unsustainable and sustainable, meaning that to some extent the government is relying on revenue from those taxes on sustainable products. What Team Proposition does is it limits the funds that are going to the government, leaving the government with two options. Option number one, citizens are taxed more, because the government still needs money to be able to function properly and keep up its economy, and the only way to do that if we're taking away this tax is for another tax to be imposed, and therefore those same citizens are simply going to be taxed more. That would reduce their quality of life, and actually goes to specifically reference the Apple example that they talked about. See, Apple in specific if citizens are taxed more, they're going to be supporting these good companies, or they're supporting companies less. For two reasons. First of all, those companies are going to become more expensive, and second of all, that the citizens, now that they're being taxed, don't have as much money as they did before. So companies like Apple, and we agree that they're supporting LGBT rights, and that's a great thing, but they're going to be getting less support because citizens have less money to deal with, as the government is now directly taxing them, as opposed to taxing the companies through the company's products. That's the first option, is that the citizens are taxed more. The second option that the government has is simply to remain underfunded. Because we're taking away some of their funding, they could just remain underfunded, and that leads to a catastrophe of things that could happen. Let's look first to why the government is actually necessary. The government is necessary, first of all, because they're needed to create regulations to limit people from essentially doing bad stuff. They're researching constantly to determine how to regulate their own economy, regulate their own people and government, so that they can have a sustainable country. They're also in charge of creating systems to help people who have had bad stuff done to them. Think of healthcare or the refugee situations that we've seen around the world. The reason that we're able to promote healthcare and protect refugees is because of the governments that are in place that have funding and are strong enough to be able to support those things. Finally, governments are also necessary so that they can work with other nations to stop them from doing bad stuff. That only happens when they have enough money, and when they have enough money, they can work on LGBT rights, human rights, etc. Your question?
You've completely failed to clash with my partner's argument, where she specifically brought up that you're going to be saving money because the government now doesn't have to invest its own funds in the environmental provisions because companies do it themselves.
Not necessarily. No, that goes back to the original argument that's assuming that companies will be incentivized now to specifically deal with these sustainable practices. However, what we've already shown is that most of the time these bad practices end up being cheaper. You can hire child labor for practically free. You can dump all your waste into the river and you don't have to pay for that. And those bad practices are unsustainable. You have to pay a tax, but ultimately you're still saving money because of all the money that you're saving by not walking through all the sustainable practices. So until they address that, there's absolutely no reason to assume that the government or that these companies are saving money at all. So now that we know what the government is needed for, is protecting a lot of things when it's funded, we see that if we disallow some of this funding to occur, if we take away their revenue from those sustainable products, we are limited on how much we can do those things. We're limited on how much the government can protect its own people. We're limited on how much the government can contribute to healthcare or refugee crises. And we're also limited onto how much the government can contribute around the world to other countries, helping them with things like their LGBT crises or human rights in general as a result, because they now no longer have the same amount of money as they had before. We can look to examples of where the government is good, such as Norway, where they're giving a lot of people healthcare because they have the means and ability, as far as funds go, to be able to support that. We can look to the EPA, something that's specifically talked about by Team Proposition, where they give 900 regulations annually. We agree that's a great thing. The problem is that with Team Proposition, we're reducing the amount of funding that the government has, and now those 900 regulations turn into far fewer because the government is working with less money. We can also look to something like the German company Energy Wind, who is trying to veer the country away from nuclear power, getting to more sustainable practices, etc. So the government has a very, very large and great hand in helping the government and helping the country move towards sustainable practices. However, if we take away the tax that's currently on these companies, we disallow the government from being able to help because we limit their resources, and ultimately that's detrimental to the people in a way that Team Proposition simply cannot fix.
I found it kind of interesting that the entire last speech by the opposition speaker really is talking about a motion that we're not debating in today's debate round. Not only that, but the points that do apply actually don't even stand when you actually look at what the proposition team is saying. I'm going to go ahead and look at this as I go down and respond to each argument that the opposition team speaker made. then bring up a third substantive for the proposition team, talking about prices and the effects on consumers. Let's go ahead and start off where they talk about basically it's not necessarily cheaper for these companies to actually be sustainable. They brought up the example of child labor. I have really two responses to this. First of all, child labor, although it's horrible, has absolutely nothing to do with this motion in today's debate. We're talking about the effects of production on the environment, not labor practices, whether or not the labor practices in other countries are bad or not. This is irrelevant in today's debate round. It's not under the motion. The second response to this is sure, some companies may not change. We never said that every single company in every single country that basically puts this tax break for companies, that every single company is going to change. That's not what we're saying at all. We're saying that, yes, not all companies will change. The companies that it's actually beneficial for them to change will do so. And if even one company changes under the proposition team's model, we get more benefits than if you sided with the opposition team. Sure, maybe not every company will change, but what we've seen is that for some companies, it will be beneficial. And if even one company actually does switch, then it'd be more beneficial to vote for the proposition team. Moving down, they responded to our examples of China by basically saying China has no value-added tax. While this does respond to the example about air pollution, first of all, I'd like to point out that air pollution in China just shows the fact that air pollution in general is a very harmful form of pollution that we should not be encouraging. Secondly, it actually does not respond to the point about electronic waste, because electronic waste is not produced in China, it's actually produced in other countries, and then exported to China. What we're seeing is that actually if these countries use less dangerous chemicals in their products, make it more sustainable for the environment, it's less harmful to the people that actually end up handling this electronic waste, these people in China, where as a result, we don't get nearly as many children getting lead poisoning if you vote for the proposition team. Ultimately, what we see is that this was an insufficient response to this argument. So ultimately, it does not disprove that we're going to reduce the amount of damage that happens to these people in China. Let's go ahead and move down where they talked about how, we're talking about how basically Apple is unsustainable. And our example of Apple didn't really apply because Apple uses products that are unsustainable. First of all, I'd like to point out, specifically talking about Apple, they never brought up specifically how Apple couldn't change to sustainable products just because they're unsustainable right now. Does not necessarily mean that they can't actually change. So this really does not actually disprove the proposition team's argument. Yes?
So why would companies, though, like Apple, have incentive to change when it'd probably just be cheaper for them to keep paying the tax and doing their unsustainable practices?
Unfortunately for the opposition team in today's debate round, they simply stated that it would be cheaper for them to stay with unsustainable practices, bringing up a singular example that doesn't actually apply under this motion. But we've actually seen that getting rid of the taxes would bring more profit to these companies, and as a result, even if not all companies change, some companies would in fact change to sustainable practices. As a result, we still see that the proposition team side is warranted. Let's go ahead and move down and look at their substantive that they talk about, how there's less ability to actually promote. I believe they were meaning to say sustainable practices. I heard unsustainable practices. They had a couple of different layers of analysis under this. It all entirely rested upon the fact that the government was going to get less revenue. Basically, they were going to have less taxes. The problem is their argument only applies if they really responded to effectively my partner's argument about how the government makes up that revenue by not having to spend it on the environment. The problem is their only response is that every company might not switch, which we totally agree with, that not every company is going to switch to sustainable practices. But what we're saying is that companies are going to change, a large number of companies are going to change. Even if one company changed, the cost of them changing in tax revenue would be more than made up in the amount that they actually help the environment. Let's go ahead and look at their second layer of analysis, where they basically said that people, because they have less money, are going to somehow support LGBT rights and other such rights less. I'm actually going to respond to this by talking about this third substantive from the proposition team side, actually talking about how people are going to have more money if you vote for the proposition team, because simply prices are going to go down if you voted for the proposition team. Really, what we're looking at right now is there are already sustainable products that exist right now. That's really why we're having the debate at all, because sustainable products are possible and they do exist, and we want companies to use those sustainable products. But what that means is right now there's a certain number of companies, there's a certain level of competition in these different areas. What we as the proposition team are doing is incentivizing companies to actually go into these different areas of competition for sustainable products. What that means is if there's more competition, it leads to lower prices, just according to really the law of supply and demand. There's more supply, there's more companies actually competing, there's the same amount of demand, the price simply goes down. That's just simple economics. What we see is that ultimately, actually consumers are not going to be harmed, people are not going to have less money, but ultimately they're going to have more money. So really on two levels in today's debate round, we support LGBT rights and really minority rights. We see that the companies ultimately make more money because they get this tax exemption, which is it gives them more money than actually being unsustainable does, or else they wouldn't have switched in the first place. But secondly, consumers actually have more money. The average person has more money because they get lower prices. As a result, on really two levels in today's debate round, we as the proposition team actually support minority rights. Yes.
We still need you to explain a little bit better how the government actually saves money, because you're telling us that the government spends less money on regulations or manufacturing. Doesn't government regulation still have to exist and government employees still have to enforce current regulations?
Sure, but again, as we brought up, specifically with the EPA creating 900 regulations a year, they won't necessarily have to create 900 new regulations a year. The problems they're trying to solve have already been solved by companies taking action. So sure, maybe not the current costs are going to go down because they're not necessarily going to abolish their current regulations. What we're saying is it's going to cost the government less because they now have to regulate less, because these companies are now actually already taking action. I actually kind of responded to this by saying that more government regulation, these 900 regulations, having less of them was a bad thing. But my response to this is it's actually a good thing, because the problem gets solved without the government actually having to spend their money. They can actually spend their money on other things such as minority rights and guaranteeing human rights. As a result, what we see in today's debate round is ultimately, under the proposition team's model, everybody really gets benefits. The companies that don't switch, well, they just stay the same and aren't affected. The companies that do switch ultimately get a profit because the tax rate gives them more than being unsustainable does, and the government, as a result, also gets more benefits because of the environmental benefits. Thank you.
So what I'm going to be doing in the second opposition speech is I'm going to be going over everything Team Proposition just said, showing you why their mindset is flawed. Then I'm going to be presenting our second substantive, which talks about how they're actually making environmental damage worse, and they're actually propagating a horrible mindset and instilling it throughout society. So let's start with their case, their first point, in which the speaker talks about why actually it's easier and cheaper for them to be sustainable. We say that this just is completely not true. Why is it not cheaper for companies to be sustainable? It's cheaper for them to engage in bad practices because bad practices are more convenient. They're easier. It's easier to go out and chop down a tree than it is to go through a complicated process of instilling maybe desanitation, maybe instilling practices that are going to actually help your environment, that are actually going to get you more environmental protection than going through regulation. So it's cheaper because it's more convenient, because it's more easily accessible. Why do you think companies pollute and engage in such terrible environmental damage? It's because it's cheaper for them, they make a better profit. The speaker didn't respond to this logic. He simply said, child labor doesn't apply. But we say that child labor is a great example. We weren't trying to get them to have a debate about if child labor was bad. We were trying to get them to have a debate about whether or not practices that are bad are cheaper, in which we see that child labor is an excellent example of a bad practice that's cheaper. Then they say, well, we don't have to prove that every company will change. The speaker tells us that even if just one company changes, then we'll be benefited. And we'll be getting to this flawed mindset when we look at their example of government revenues. The next thing they talked about was China. Again, he didn't respond to, well, he said, yeah, their point about how, the tax doesn't apply to China, the VAT tax, that kind of took care of the example, which it did. But he said, air pollution is still bad. Yes, we agree, air pollution is bad. And as I talk about in our second substantive, they increase these bad environmental harms. Then they go on and respond to yet, not logic or explanation, yet just another example of Apple. They say, Apple, even though it's not sustainable right now, it will and it can change. We tell you that there's even companies like Apple that literally produce products like the iPhone that will not be biodegradable anytime in the near future or ever. We say that they don't respond to the logic behind this point, which is that some companies can't be in sustainable practices and that companies like Apple that are in unsustainable practices won't switch because it's cheaper for them, as I just explained, to be in unsustainable practices than it is for them to be in this. Then let's move on to what they said to our first, or to their point, which talked about the government revenue. Now, under this, they tell us two things. They talk about the citizens, which we'll get to in a second, and the government. And this is the key contradiction on side proposition. They say that, okay, the government has more money because it doesn't have to deal with environmental regulations. Then they turn around in the same breath and tell you that their case is going to be beneficial, even if they can prove that just one company switches. We tell you, though, that if one company switches, the government is still going to deal with hundreds upon hundreds of government regulation. So we say that their little argument about how, if one company switches, you can still vote for them is just completely false because that actually disproves all their points. But let's take proposition at their best case scenario, which says that a lot of companies are going to switch, which we already showed you isn't true because it's not in their best interest, but let's just say they do. And we talk about how if more companies do this, then what Austin talks about in his first point is that this is actually going to decrease funding for the government. Why? Because he's talking about how the government is going to have less taxes from all these companies that are switching. That's going to decrease the government's ability to operate in society. And they also kind of give you this idea under here that under their plan, the government won't have to deal with things like regulations. Again, to further explain this, we say that government regulations are still going to exist, that companies aren't the only people who cause environmental damage. Consumers cause environmental harm. So we say that they're not dealing with all of environmental regulations. The government is actually going to take away revenue from them. They're going to lose revenue. Then they go on to their third substantive, which is talking, they say, well, people are going to make more. But we have two scenarios for you, and in both cases, citizens don't end up making more money. The first is this, under side proposition, the government has all this tons of more funding, which we explained to you why that's not true. But if that does happen, that means that the citizens aren't having more money because they're being taxed through the VAT tax, which is essentially a sales tax on these products. So they're having to pay more, which means the citizens are actually losing more money. But the second and more likely scenario, which we explained to you on side opposition, is that the government is losing its revenue. And what does the government have to do when it's losing its revenue? Is it has to raise taxes in order that it makes more revenue. So we took and say that citizens are actually in the end going to be losing money because when the government loses its revenue, they're actually going to have to increase the taxes on the citizens and take more money from them. Yes.
For all the parents in the room, would you say that these parents in the room would rather have their children have a 69% chance of getting lead poisoning or pay roughly 10% more on their taxes, maybe worst case scenario?
Okay, so I think what the question is getting at here is, would they rather have sustainable practices? Of course we would. Like, that's not in contention today. We think that environmental protection is a good thing, but we tell you that, first of all, you can't ensure that these companies are going to switch, and further, they actually don't have an incentive to switch because it's cheaper for them not to. And that even if you can prove that one company, doesn't switches, that doesn't mean that your whole case is going to win, because in that case, then the government is still losing revenue, which is a harm we show on our side. Let's move to our second substantive, which is talking about how their case is actually furthering environmental damage. And this is key, because the whole assumption of their case and all their benefits rest on the environment being better. But there's a few reasons and levels of analysis as to why the environment is actually harmed. Because when you have companies who are engaging in these sustainable practices, what's going to happen? You're obviously going to have the other companies that still exist that have bad practices and don't promote unsustainable practices. And what we talk about is that they do this because they're cheaper. And what's happening is, yes, we agree that products are probably going to be a little bit cheaper if they use sustainable practices. But then the companies who are using unsustainable practices, they will then, in order to try and compete with the companies that use sustainable practices, first off, they'll do two things. They won't switch to sustainable practices because it's harder, it's not as convenient, it's more expensive. And then two, they'll have to try and make their products cheaper and lesser quality in order to try and compete with the companies that are using the sustainable practices. So whenever they try to make their products cheaper, what do? They engage more in these bad environmental practices. A great example is Mongolia. So Mongolia, a ton of its country is polluted with rare earth mineral waste from companies like Apple who are using these unsustainable practices. But what's the point? What are we saying? Why does this impactful on side opposition? They do this because it's cheaper and companies won't change because ultimately they can afford and they will to just keep paying the taxes like they're already doing and still making a profit, engaging in bad environmental practices that are cheaper, and they won't just switch over to these sustainable practices because it's harder. The second level of explanation we give you under this is not only does it practically hurt the environment, we see that you're also entrenching a gross mindset. This mindset that environmental protection is only good when it's good for you, when it profits you, when you make money. We see that side proposition intrinsically ties the earth and environmental protection to money, saying that we should only do it when it profits us. But we think that this is a bad mindset because essentially this tells companies that they shouldn't be protecting the environment because it's a good thing or because we all live in it, because it's a global issue, because it's something that we should all do as our duty as human beings, but that they should only do it for self-interest. And we think that this in the long term fixes nothing because ultimately, as we've seen, when it's cheaper, then they keep going to the unsustainable practices, which harms the environment, loses government revenue, and in the end hurts the citizens.
Clashes in today's debate round. The first is whether or not companies will change. And the second is, can the government feasibly survive with this loss in tax revenue? And before I get to examining these two big clashes which determine the winner of today's debate round, I will address some of the more humorous aspects of the last speech. Because what we find interesting about the opposition team's stance in this debate round is that instead of debating like the best case and worst case scenarios, they're only taking these worst case scenarios and trying to make our side sound ludicrous. So in response to our argument about how Apple can change, their response, literally word for word, was Apple iPhones won't be biodegradable. No, duh, is my only response. We're not saying that the definition of sustainable is that all products become biodegradable. Like, that's not the definition of sustainable by any means whatsoever. We specifically defined sustainable at the beginning of our first prop speech, talking about how environmental sustainability can be in the means of production. So even if the iPhone doesn't biodegrade, if it's made in a more clean environmental manner, that's still sustainable practices. Now, like, after that it's cheaper to hurt the environment. Bad practices are always cheaper. Our response again is no, duh. Why? Because we literally said that in the first speech. The only reason companies are taking practice and taking part in hurting the environment is because it's cheaper. We get that. We understand basic economics. But we'll get to why companies will change in this clash in just a moment. Then they talk about how government regulation still exists. Therefore, we save the government no money. Again, no, duh. We are not saying that the EPA is not going to pass any laws regarding the environment in the United States. We're simply saying that because they have to produce a wealth less, they're not going to have to produce nearly as many laws and have to enforce nearly as many laws, that they save money, and I'll explain this in just one moment. Now, the final thing that they brought up is that incentives are bad, because then you're telling companies they shouldn't be helping the environment of their own accord, but that you're placing a monetary value on the environment. My question for you is, why is this bad? Essentially, they're saying if we place a monetary value on the environment, we are somehow doing something unethical. By helping the environment, we have to put a monetary value on it, but we contend that saving lives and not exposing children to lead poisoning is worth a monetary value. They have what they're saying is that we're going to tell companies that they should only help the environment if they get paid. That's not at all what this is going to show. By allowing them this tax break, all it's going to show companies is how incredibly important it is to the government that they help the environment, only proving further the stance that the environment needs to be protected. So let's get to these two clashes. You have a question.
And yet you've still never shown that the tax breaks that these companies will have is so significant that they won't engage in these bad practices.
Yep, that's the first clash, as I brought up, that two companies change. Like, that's what we're going to talk about. So the question for today's debate round is the tax break enough of a margin for companies to spend the extra on sustainability? Here's the reason that we contend that this margin is sufficient. Because there are already companies out there making sustainable products. Here's what Team Opposition is trying to say. They're trying to say the difference between an unsustainable water bottle and a sustainable water bottle that was made in a clean manner and the plastic is recyclable is that environmentally sustainable water bottle is going to be 5 times more expensive. That makes no sense whatsoever. The difference between sustainability and unsustainability in manufacturing techniques are clearly small, because otherwise companies right now wouldn't be practicing sustainable practices. So yes, we contend that there is enough of a margin that companies are going to change. Let's take Europe as an example. Europe has a 15% VAT tax. The opposition team is saying that extra 15% that companies have is not enough to make a cleaner product. We disagree with that. Now, not every single case is companies going to change. Like, we're not at all saying that all the companies who right now are making non-sustainable products are going to make sustainable products. All we contend is that there are absolutely, beyond a shadow of a doubt, companies out there who this tax break will be big enough for them to change. Now, of course, this is a round in world school debates where you don't get computers to look up statistics and to bring examples. So we're not going to bring up these specific examples of specific companies because we don't have those numbers. But I would like to hear the common sense logic from the opposition team to see a tax break such as in Europe of a 15% would not be enough for companies to change and make more sustainable products. Because given the fact that they're already making sustainable products, there's clearly the margin for them to still compete in the market, which means if they were 15% more expensive or more, they probably wouldn't be making sustainable products right now. Go ahead.
This isn't actually a benefit on their income, a 15% improvement. It's just a 15% reduction on the cost of a certain raw material that they put into their product and then pass that cost on to the consumer when they sell it.
The tax regardless is going to do one of two things. Either they're going to keep the price the same because they know the market already is willing to pay that much, or because we don't live in North Korea and there's competition between markets, they're going to decrease the price on the consumers, which means, yes, they are going to get more revenue because they've decreased the price and now get more products sold. So the second clash is, can the government feasibly survive? Is this tax revenue decrease going to destroy the government? Now, the first thing that obviously sounds horrible is the simple fact that we're not preventing the government from implementing other taxes. Now, if the government reduces the VAT tax and says, well, for these certain companies who produce sustainable products, we're not going to put the VAT tax on them, they may lose some money there that they have to make up through another tax. But we contend that this is worth it specifically because of the lives that this saves. But that's the worst case scenario response. There are two other responses we brought up that have gone unaddressed. The first one is because they're not constantly passing policies to clean up the pollutants, because the pollutants aren't being put into the environment in the first place, they are going to save money. What's the number one environmental policy that countries typically pass? It's a policy to clean up things after they've already been put into the environment, and because those cost money, preventing those pollutants from being in the environment in the first place is going to save them money. But the second way that it saves them money that we specifically brought up that's been unaddressed is that the companies who are going to gain more revenue through this because they're able to get more products sold are going to advance human rights and save the government money because now the government doesn't have to invest in those programs. So we specifically talked about when the companies in our second contention want to make more money, they want to build consumer confidence. How do they do this? They specifically support causes that consumers like, such as human rights causes, LGBT, feminism, things like that. Now, when companies are investing their money in those sorts of causes, the government doesn't need to invest as much of its money. This has been completely unaddressed in today's debate round. So yes, the government does save money. Even if they can disprove both of these arguments, the government increasing taxes in another area so that it doesn't go under is worth it in our opinion because saving lives does not equal some monetary value. It's limitless. Lives are absolutely worth whatever cost this takes. So the two clashes that we talked about in today's debate round are both important because one, we show companies want to change because they have this monetary incentive to do so. Now, even if the affirmative team is right and not all companies, the opposition team is right and not all companies change, the fact that some of these companies do still change means that the environment does still be protected in some way, even though it's not quantifiable. We get that this is this vague amoeba of terms that we're not able to quantify, but the facts still remain that this is a big enough incentive because we have logic supporting that, given the fact that there's already a sustainable product market, that the opposition team has not actually disproven with any logic or clash that companies won't want to change. They've just asked us to prove that, and we've done so to the best of our ability, knowing economics without statistics. Finally, we know that the government can survive, and because of that, we save more lives than they do, and because they brought up no disadvantages uniquely to our case, we advocate for a proposition ballot.
Can we like close the
Yes.
Yeah.
While side proposition has some pretty economics and some flowery rhetoric on their side, they really don't have the right ideas when it comes to what corporations actually do now and why. They also don't have the right ideas on what's actually in their products. With that, let's go to the two clashes. The first is going to be environmental protection and actually who solves that issue. The second is going to be government funding and the impacts of whether or not that goes up or down or how it's affected. With that, let's get to the idea of environmental protection. And the main idea under this is the question about, will corporations change? Will they actually increase the environmental sustainability of what side proposition defines to be the way that they produce their product? For instance, when you have an iPhone that's being made in China by the corporation Foxconn that uses child labor, let's just remember that. What actually goes into the iPhone? Well, a lot of electronic parts that come from something called rare earth minerals. They're not actually that rare, they're just called that for some strange reason, I've never known why. What they do with, the way that they process those rare earth minerals is so toxic and so dangerous and so horrible for the environment that they pump it into this massive toxic lake in Mongolia that's several miles across. Now, you don't read about this stuff because it's not very pretty, but the BBC does some wonderful reporting on this if you're ever interested. Now, the interesting thing about this is that this is the cheapest, fastest, most profitable way to do it. Now, Apple is a company known for its profit. It's known for its demand. People don't care if their iPhone is sustainable or not. I think I'm probably the only one in this room that knew about the giant toxic lake in Mongolia before this round happened, okay? Now, the interesting thing about this is that when Side Proposition somehow incentivizes a company that has hundreds of billions of dollars of cash in their bank account to change the way that they process their most profitable product in the history of the world, what do we end up with? We end up with a phone that's still going to break in the next few years, thanks to planned obsolescence. And we end up with the issue of e-waste still being sent to developing countries. The iPhone does not get more biodegradable, which they agreed to. We can't make our iPhone out of recycled plastic water bottles or bamboo. It doesn't work that way. And we cannot process rare earth minerals in a sustainable manner. It simply doesn't happen. And just because Apple may be able to put a little green leaf on the back of their iPhone once they change their practices does not mean that their products are clean. I'm sorry, but the iPhone will always be dirty. It does do very well at timing though, so that's good. Let's move on to the next idea of whether or not companies will actually save money. So what Side Proposition gives us some fancy numbers on, well, they have a 15% VAT tax, but we really don't know anything else. We're just guessing that it'll be cheaper for them to make environmentally sustainable products. Here's the interesting thing. They really don't prove their side of the motion with arguments like that. They tell us, well, we don't know much, but theoretically it might be cheaper. That is not an argument. That is not something that we can vote for to prove the motion. All that proves is they have an idea that something might be helpful in the future, but they don't actually get there. What does get us there is protecting the environment, not just for money, but protecting the environment because it's good. What gets there is actual regulations, not just financial incentives that companies continuously ignore. Not just financial incentives that companies don't care about because they're the most profitable corporation on the face of the earth. With that, let's move on to the ideas of companies polluting. Why do companies pollute? Side Proposition tells you, well, we don't actually know. But they'll definitely not pollute because they might make a little bit more money. Yet we understand already that companies pollute because it is far cheaper. The pollution does not change under Side Proposition. We might get a couple water bottle companies that start manufacturing their water bottles, or a couple of pencil companies that change the way they build their pencils, but that's it. E-waste doesn't change. Air pollution doesn't change. Manufacturing doesn't change. Coal production doesn't change. Unsustainable and inhuman practices like child labor don't change. Nothing changes under Side Proposition except that it's a little better off for the companies that make their pencils out of bamboo. That's what we get, and that's the best case scenario, honestly, but that's really not good enough to change the entire way that we view environmental protection and make it based off of money. With that, let's move on to the idea of companies saving money through cleanup. This was brought up in the third speech, not really addressed earlier in the round, but we'll address it anyway. First of all, companies don't clean up their mess. I think we can all figure this out. Coal mining companies in the United States don't clean up their mess. They say, oh, we're bankrupt now, we can't do it. Apple doesn't clean up their mess. E-waste companies don't clean up their mess. When people use artisanal mining and child labor in parts of India, they don't clean up their mess. Companies don't clean up their mess. Yes?
The government cleans up the mess. That was the entire point. And because the government won't have to clean up the mess after our plan,
We'll get to the government. We'll get to the government.
All right.
The interesting thing is, what Side Proposition doesn't tell you is there's still a mess. We don't get rid of the mess. It's always here. We always have e-waste. We always have the giant toxic lake. We always have unbiodegradable and unsustainable practices because we're human and we like the way the flashy screen looks. It doesn't work to make it all sustainable just for a couple of extra dollars, 15% of what companies buy their raw materials for. The next idea is that countries will increase their bad practices, and here's why. Because children are cheaper to hire. Why? Because they pay them nothing. When we look to car companies like BMW that buy paint from companies that use their paint, that use mica in the manufacturing of their paint. The mica industry in India uses 20,000 children in the mica manufacturing industry in India. Illegal, unreported, but discovered thanks to investigative journalism. What we can see here is that companies use these products because it's far cheaper. This doesn't change. Child labor is not a reason to vote against side proposition, but what it tells us is that companies will do anything to make a dollar. Likely, that anything does not come from environmental protection. Let's cover the idea of government funding. What side proposition pins their entire case on is that we won't need the regulatory agencies. We won't need to make any more laws. We won't really need to do anything. Unreasonable representation, I know. What they're really saying is we may need a fewer government employees, we may need a fewer regulation. Maybe the government won't have to clean things up as much. Where's the impact of that? If we only get a little bit, where is it? If they want to improve the environment, eliminate e-waste. If they want to improve lead poisoning, fix it. Not just say, oh, well, we get a little bit, we don't claim to solve all of it. That's the point. They don't solve it. They don't even get a little bit. They don't even tell you exactly why we end up with less trash. Which we know. That is the situation we end up with. Secondly, what the government ends up with is less money. And either the government ends up with less money or citizens end up with less money. They both can't have more money. It's not like we increase the amount of euros floating around. Either the government gets more money because they tax the citizens, or the citizens get more money and the government has nothing to, number one, promote LGBT rights abroad and in their own country. Number two, promote environmental protection on a real level, not just giving companies a few dollars to change the way they manufacture their products. Number three, promoting clean and sustainable energy practices that will actually solve the problems of air pollution. These are the things that side proposition infers that they attempt to solve, but they don't tell you that they do solve them or that they even try to solve them, and if they do, how. The government and citizens can't have more money, so take your pick, but in the end, we're going to end up with the option we don't like, which is we have less money and the government has less money, and it gets frittered away in a policy that ends up with more environmental pollution. The government doesn't save money off of this because they don't spend money off of this. No one cleans up the e-waste, not companies, not governments, and that is why side proposition has no reason for it.
Reply of today's debate round. I'm just going to be going over the clashes, what happened in today's debate, what the main issues were, what each side's stances on each of these issues were, and then finally, whose model came out essentially weightier in the end, and whose arguments in the best case scenario are actually going to improve our world. Let's start with really the two major issues we believe both sides agree on, was looking at environmental protection and which side is actually going to help that, and also looking at government funding. And seeing that, yes, the government does do good things with its funding, which side is going to get it more. Let's move on then to looking at, okay, what does the proposition team tell us? What are their three main points? First off, they say that this is going to incentivize good behavior. This has been one of the most contentious things in today's debate round, because we showed you how actually it doesn't. Why? Because first off, it's not cheaper. And this analysis really never got a lot of engagement with because we explained why it wasn't cheaper. We explained that it's not as convenient, it's not as easy, you have to go through more processes, it's more complicated, you have to go through more regulation. And they said, what? They said it's cheaper because companies already do it. That makes no sense, and they didn't explain that, they simply just asserted that. Then in their second point, they tell us that we're actually on their side getting the government more revenue. They say this because they say, First, the government is going to be able to not have to spend money in doing all their environmental regulations. And we respond to this by saying, even if you believe them that the government gets to decrease a ton of its regulations, there's still waste. First off, already in society, there's still waste caused from the production of these products. There's still waste caused from the consumers of these products. And they really just say, well, the government gets more funding. We also go a step further to say the government doesn't get as much money because it's actually losing tax revenue. Then finally they say, well, the citizens are going to get more money. We say no, because when the government, as we've proved to, loses money, they have to tax the citizens more. Our last year explained to you why they can't say citizens have the most money, government has the most money. It simply doesn't work, because we're not just like increasing the amount of money by a ton. Let's move on to looking at which side had basically the weightiest arguments today. And I want to take each proposition speech by speech because we saw a major shift. And I want to show how we developed each of these speeches. First, they told us that lots of companies are going to change. And we tell you that even if lots of companies change, there's still going to be less government revenue, which is a bad thing because there's still going to be lots of production. It's going to increase a lot of e-waste. There's still going to be consumer waste. Government still has to spend more, which means it reduces its funding. And we believe that this speech was probably the strongest stance this proposition took. And we even showed why that wasn't true. Because we showed why even when there's more, if they can somehow prove, which they haven't, that more companies do this, we showed why there's still going to be tons of waste. The government increases its revenue, which means that it's not going to have as much money to do good things, and the environment is left worse. Then in their second speech, they get up and they say, well, even if we can prove now just one company does this. And we show you why this is totally ridiculous, because there would be no impact of this, because there's still hundreds of companies committing and exploiting horrible environmental problems. Then finally, their third speaker says, well, we want to show you why it's good if just some companies do this. But what we've seen today is they haven't shown why even if, these companies, even if some of them doing it, have a 15% increase, how is that going to outweigh the cheapness they get in making these products badly? How does this 15%, they never told us this or explained to us why, this outweighs the cheap child labor that they could do? The cheapness of throwing all their waste in a lake in Mongolia. That's free. They didn't show us why their side said, well, they'll get this 15% tax break, it's going to make it better. They didn't show us, that's awesome, why it's going to actually fix the problem. But what do we stand left with on side opposition? We say that this decreases government revenue, makes it less effective, they have less taxes, they're not able to advocate as well for citizens who are going to be taxed more, and we show you that it entrenches a gross mindset, saying the environment is just out there for money. This doesn't fix long-term problems, and it actually de-incentivizes companies because they'll want to produce their products more cheaply, which means they'll even exploit the environment further, which is why you have to side with opposition.
I'm going to be wrapping up this round and showing you how the proposition team has won both debates in this debate round. First, the one about the motion, and second, which team can impact the LGBT community the most. Let's go ahead and start off with this idea about Apple. Now, they brought up the example of Apple dumping a lot of their waste into a river in Mongolia and how they have no incentive to change. My first problem with this argument is that we're not claiming that our plan is perfect. We're not saying we're going to solve for every corporation that dumps stuff into lakes in Mongolia. If that were the goal of the proposition team's plan, then maybe that argument would have had some ground. But since that's not the goal, they don't have that ground. Not every company is Apple, as any Android lover knows. We have all sorts of companies that we're now going to have that incentive. They brought the example of water bottles. There's plenty more. You have people who make office supplies, who make printers, who can use more sustainable materials like plastics, who can actually benefit from that 15% tax break. We have proven that to today's debate round. Apple dumping their things into Mongolian lakes is not a reason for you to vote for the opposition team. But secondly, we still get those benefits. So even though we're not solving for all of pollution and all of dumping, which is not what our goal was anyway, we still get those benefits without any unique disadvantage that actually holds water that the opposition team is giving you in this debate round. Their next argument, saying that we're just guessing that 15% is enough. That is not accurate. We gave you a very logical explanation as to why 15% of a tax break is definitely enough. The reason being is that there's already a market for these sustainable consumer products. If there was a product out there that was made with sustainable materials that was that much more expensive because it was so much harder to have these sustainable materials and have these sustainable practices, then that market wouldn't exist. But the fact that it does exist proves the fact that in fact a 15% tax break would be sufficient. But what did we get from the opposition bench? No logical explanation as to why 15% would not be enough, because child labor, as we both agree, doesn't apply. Their next argument, talking about how companies don't clean up their mess. Well, here's the solution. Make the mess less messy. And that's exactly what the proposition team plan does, by using more sustainable materials and by using the sustainable consumer products. Their next argument, talking about how companies will do anything to save $1. And that is exactly what the proposition team has been telling you for the last hour. Companies will do anything to save $1. And because we've proven to you that they will be saving $1 by passing the proposition team ballot, that means the opposition team agrees we've won this debate. Their next argument, talking about how they don't solve. So here's the burden that the opposition team is putting on the proposition, to stop all pollution. If they can give me any feasible policy that is going to stop all pollution, I'm all ears. But since there is no such policy, it doesn't exist in the real world, that is a ludicrous reason for you to vote for the opposition team. Let's talk about the two main clashes in today's debate round. The first, is it enough for us to have this 15% tax break, or whatever the percentage is in the respective country? Absolutely. Because we've proven to you through logic, because the market exists, because there are companies already out there making sustainable consumer products, this is feasible. The second, is the government going to go under if you pass a proposition team's ballot? We've proven to you that it is not the case, because not only are we not preventing them from making new taxes and getting more revenue, if that's absolutely necessary, we've also proven to you the benefit that comes with that, by saving human lives, by stopping a percentage of that air pollution, maybe not all of it, but at least a substantial portion through this manufacturing that is coming about through all of these environmental practices that are bad. By showing you that we have in fact shown that this is something that is logistic, it is something that is feasible, and it is something that warrants your ballot. Thank you.